2003, President Roh Moo-hyun issued an official apology to the victims and survivors of the Jeju uprising. In his statement, he mentioned the enormous damage of human life and loss of property and offered sincere apology and consolation to bereaved families and Jeju Islanders for the wrongdoings of past government powers. And this is the speech. You can hear the breathing. It's not here, it's actually Chuan breathing.
이유 중에 하나인 사건이 발생했습니다. 제주도민들은 국제적인 내용들과 민족 분단이 몰고 온 역사의 숨막힌 밑에서 엄청난 인명 피해와 재산 손실을 입었습니다. 제주도에서 1947년 4월 1일을 기점으로 하여 1948년 4월 3일 발생한 제주 막노당 제주도당은 부장공기 그리고 1954년 9월 21일까지 있었던 무역 충돌과 진압 과정에서 많은 사람들이 무고하게 희생되었습니다. 저는 위원회의 건의를 받아들여 국정을 책임지고 있는 대통령으로서 과거 국가 권력의 잘못에 대해 유족과 제주도민 여러분에게 진심으로 사과와 위로의 말씀을 드립니다. 무고하게 희생된 영령들을 추모하며 삼가 면목을 듭니다. 존경하는 국민 여러분.
After this apology, Roh had a chance to speak with a widow named Im Bok-soon, as you see in the picture. He asked her if there was anything that she needed. The widow responded shortly, "I'd like a casket and a shroud in recognition of our hardship," unquote. In a humble but ironic tone, she spoke of the social and historical difficulties that widows like herself endured during the Cold War. Like other period of Korean history, women's experience during the Jeju uprising and the Korean War has not been studied widely until recently. In addition to existing works on U.S. camp towns in English, there is Song-rae Kim's article, famous article on sexual violence during the Jeju uprising, and also Lee Ma's monograph on Korean war widows. I think this is a very significant work, also hers too. On my part, I became interested in the widows' experience through my own research on anti-communist massacres. A bit of self-promo here. My book, Korea's Grievous War, takes the counterinsurgency campaign in Jeju as the starting point of a series of anti-communist massacres that took place through the Korean War. To show the human dimension of the history, I conducted a number of oral interviews with victims and their families. Much of the interviews are contained in the last chapter, The Bereaved Families. The chapter studied the life stories of survivors and their children. One of the groups that I've not fully covered here were the widows. Actually, this is due to the bureaucratic issue. The tenure system in Australia, the probation is 3 years. In the United States, 7 years, you have to get something published. But also there was another reason. Their experiences were somewhat different, actually very different from the children's, in the sense that their struggles had specifically gender dimension to it and went beyond the issue of political marginalization. Also, a lot of interview contents talked about their personal lives. That was actually disproportionately larger than their testimony of witnessing massacres and also unearthing the dead people's bodies. So, during the Korean conflict, more than 300,000 women were widowed in South Korea alone. And this is from Lee Ma's work. And many were in their 20s when their husband died. After the Korean War, these widows occupied a marginal place in Korean society. They were called 미망인. The Sino-Korean word 미망인, if you look at the Naver dictionary, literally means a person who has not yet died. And in the dictionary says it originated from the Chinese kind of ancient history, and that the 미망인's would call themselves 미망인 to sound humble because they have survived beyond their husband's death. But a lot of 미망인's that I talked to did not call themselves that way. They use 과부 instead. Unlike the term 과부, which referred to a woman who lives alone after her husband's death, the word 미망인 reflected traditional society's view of widows as what Mark Eliot called archetypal liminal figures because they were economically vulnerable and socially destabilizing and sexually threatening, unquote. The widow's experience was affected by the Confucian custom that diminished women's social position after her husband's death. Women could not be the head of a family registry, and their legal and social rights were restricted for a long time until quite recently. They were discouraged from remarriage, and many continued to live with their in-laws even after their husbands, sometimes for several decades. And yet they could not be part of mainstream social and economic activities due to limited education they received. Those whose husband, and also political reasons too, those husbands whose husbands died as a result of anti-communist violence were doubly marginalized. During the Cold War, there was no official recognition of such victims or their families. Until the late 1980s, the South Korean government often recognized and dignified the death of the police and soldiers, but for this reason, even though the widows of police officers, soldiers, and civilian victims shared similar difficulties, the widows of anti-communist massacre victims were more likely to remain invisible and silent. In the past few decades, however, widows have played an important role in initiating South Korean advocacy movement that led to the creation of the Truth Commissions in 2000 and also in 2005. Their activism dated back to 1960, as you see in the photograph here left, when they began to campaign for truth and justice surrounding the Korean War era killings. So this photograph is from Ulsan. In 1960, these widows just excavated the hundreds of dead bodies, the bones, and then along with other family members, they took a photograph to commemorate the commemoration itself. So they played a very important role. If you interview them, they have a really graphic memory of digging the skeletons out of the mass graves. So although they were forced into silence under authoritarian governments during the Cold War, the long-term impact of their earlier activism became more visible after South Korea democratized in 1987. From the late 1990s, liberal governments began to create special laws, launch official investigations, and issue apologies. Around this time, some widows also began to break their silence, as Im Bok-soon did. The widows' testimonies are valuable for what they can reveal about the workings of the class and gender dimensions in Korea's Cold War. According to sociologist Kim Dong-chun, the violence during this period provides a prism through which inequality, class inequality can be seen. I would say you can also see gender inequality through this prism, both of them, because these women were poor and also suffered gender discrimination to a larger degree. The widows' memories of the Cold War are embedded also in their female life experience from childhood, marriage, motherhood, and widowhood. So if you interview them, they'll say, when I was 8 months pregnant, Japan was defeated in the Pacific War, so we had to return to Jeju from Japan. So as Gail Harshiter pointed out, memory is a social process shaped by social distinction of gender in ways impossible to ignore. Unquote. That is, gender as a social condition affects the individual remembering of the past as well as the judgment of what counts as an event and is worth remembering and telling. This is also an important point in understanding Korean widows' view of the Cold War. Their view of this period has been shaped as much by their family life and the temporalities of their experience in the domestic sphere as by the forces of global politics. So my research for this paper, although not covering fully in the speech, my research centers on the life stories of 4 women who survived anti-communist violence. So Im Bok-sun is from Jeju Island, Cha Sun-rae from Ulsan, South Gyeongsang Province, Shin Sun-ok from North Jeollak Province, Jinan, which is a really deep kind of countryside, and also Lee Geum-sun from Changdo, which is Gyeongsang Province. But I cannot cover the 3 because we don't really have much time, but we'll study her history. So interviews around with them were framed around the telling of their life stories and how the death of their family member has affected them. My interviewees were mainly from rural areas. They were born in 1920s or 30s, experienced Japanese colonialism, and survived the Pacific War. So Shin Sun-ok from Jeollak Province worked in the northern part of Korea in the Japanese labor factory during the Pacific War. She was like 16 at that time. And Lee Geum-sun received a kind of call or draft to go to the Conf women's organization, and her father married her off at 16. So personal biographies are very shocking when you look into each of them. So most of these widows received almost no education or very little education, and they were married in their teens from age 16 to 19 to poor rural communities. Their husbands were accused of being communist and killed during the Jeju Uprising and the Korean War. Due to time limitation, of course, I will just talk about one person, that is Im Bok-sun. My first interviewee, Im Bok-sun, survived the Jeju Uprising. When I interviewed her in 2007, she began her testimony with this brief sentence. When I was young, I had a difficult life. She was born in 1923 to a poor family. She supported her family as a diver because her mother died when she was young. So diver is sometimes called 해녀. It's one of the most strenuous jobs in the world. So she worked from a very young age because she was so poor. Her father could not keep on feeding her, like 3-day meal, 3 meals a day. So he got her married at 16, and her husband worked in Japan at that time, so they both moved to Japan. And then there she worked in the laundry as a laundry cleaner. And Im and her husband tried to save up as much as they could and bought a small house, but they lost all these properties in 1945. Japan was defeated. Japan was defeated, and they had to return to Korea. So they came to Jeju empty-handed, and their homecoming was also marked by violent political upheaval. The brutal counter-insurgency campaign during the Jeju uprising forced ordinary islanders to flee their homes or join the rebels in the mountains. In Im's village, about 10 people went to the mountains, and one of them included her husband's cousin. Guilt by association in this time. After the cousin's disappearance, riotous youth groups started to attack Im's family, and one night they broke into her home and demanded a large sum of money. Her husband refused to pay, so they crushed his head with a rock and killed him instantly on the site. After his death, they still continued to harass her, and when she protested, they dragged her to the police station and accused her and denounced her family for being communist or being related to the rebels. Then they beat her and shot her twice with a gun. So being a survivor and widow was difficult. With her limping leg, Im continued to dive, collect seaweed, work in the rice field, and sell goods in the market. She said, quote, "People wondered if a 26-year-old woman could make a living without her husband. I did. I brought food on the table. I raised my 2 children very well, gave them education, and worked really hard." She also took care of her grandparents-in-law and served as a leader of the local union for the 해녀. And of all things, Im was most proud of her ability to support her children through secondary education. Later in her life, people in her community praised her for having lived like a brave man. Quote, "It was a compliment given to a mature woman whose age granted them social respect. But her life as a young woman was very difficult. It was a hostile world because even after she was wounded in 1948 and she stayed at her father's house for a while, the right-wing youth groups attacked the house again and tried to rape her. And she said that she resisted the rape attempt by claiming that her husband was still alive, that he worked for the police, and that there were, it was false, but that a relative was a police officer as well. The biggest fear that she had was the rumor that a woman is raped. Then people start to talk about them in the villages, and she saw several women not being able to marry because of the rumor, whether it's true or not. So she said she wasn't particularly interested in remarriage. I'm sorry, I'll probably go 2 more minutes. I measured it and it was 17 minutes. And she was not particularly interested in remarriage. She said, back in the day, if you're married again after having been married already, people would not see it as a good life or you as a worthy person. In their eyes, to be a worthy person was to be a good mother. In a Confucian society, it meant that her son would be the purpose of her life. Im's son, however, died in his late teens in an accident. And during this period, she said that she was so depressed that she considered suicide, thinking that life was not worth living. But then she continued to live for her daughter. And a few decades later, her daughter's son, that is her grandson, also died in an accident. After that, she withdrew from social life. And then finally, she came out during Rose's apology invitation. But overall, I think Im lived independently, very bravely, as a diver, as a mother, and as a union leader. But however, widows like her generation could not overcome the shackles of social custom, and this was an issue that other widows of the Korean War also shared with her. So the widows of Jeju Sasam and the Korean War survived their husband's death by adopting various strategies and by working on various jobs. Many of them remained silent about their experiences. They were also silenced by the absence of historical debate on anti-communist massacres during the Cold War. Things began to change after South Korea's democratization, when survivors and the bereaved families began to campaign for truth and justice. It was around this time that the widows took an opportunity to speak out, as Im did in this interview and also at the president's visit. On a closer look, however, the widows' grievances have a deeper roots than the Cold War. Coming from rural communities, they were born into a life of hardship. As women, they were deprived of social equality and opportunity. The long Cold War, in a sense, magnified and aggravated their already difficult social condition. The aftermath of the Korean conflict in this regard exposed the widows' position as underclass women living in an era of political extremes. Thank you very much.